Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back with you.
Great to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, although I'm sure you're also happy to be here once again. I just didn't want to fully play that one out. But anyway, long story short, we had a great story for you. Go ahead.
Oh, I think you're used to me like ruining the opening somehow, and that reaction from you was you being shocked that I didn't, but now I have. So there you go.
No, it's okay. I just honestly I didn't want to keep going down the train of saying what was pleasurable to you. I just thought it was better to just leave that one untouched. But nonetheless, we are back with you with a great show, not story, as I said earlier. As always, for all of you, I don't know, it's hard to say. We're touching so many different things from, war propaganda / psychosis, the upcoming elections in Mexico, which are heating up, some just ridiculousness as it regards big pharma, their big con. See how I did there? The meeting or potential meeting. It's maybe not is going to happen, but even the discussion about the meeting as it regards Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, talking to an independent socialist running for office in the Pittsburgh area. And we're also, of course, going to be talking at the very end. So stay tuned throughout the whole show about the just unbelievable Rico indictments against 61 activists in Atlanta as a part of the Stop Cop City movement there. So a lot there on the docket. So great show, as you can see. Good time for you to hit subscribe here on YouTube and also hit the bell so that you get the alerts of all the fantastic content like this show, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek and many other things that we are doing here. Rania, what else should our viewers know?
Well, they should know that if they appreciate this show and all of our other programming and content at Breakthrough News, they should become a member if they can by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where not only do you get to help support all of our work here, you also get access to exclusive content, including parts of my show Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, which you could make the argument, when I will, that is increasingly important because of all of the, as Eugene calls them, social explosions taking place across the African continent, as well as some very cool merch, which Eugene will put up on display right now, at least one piece of merchandise, that beautiful BT mug. I can't wait to get one of those next time I'm in New York. And look at the other side. Well, Eugene, now it's not in the frame. Thank you. Breakthrough News. It says Breakthrough News. So yeah, become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News if you can. Also, if you are interested, you can also throw in a one-time donation in the live chat on YouTube. And I will also remind our audience that it does help us in the algorithm to make sure you are not only just subscribed to Breakthrough News on YouTube, but also liking the episode. So for those who are watching, please do hit that like button so that YouTube can push us higher up into people's feeds, so more people can get the kind of content that they're not getting from CNN and all the other major mainstream outlets that aren't as cool as we are.
Indeed.
I said it.
Yes. Well, we want everyone who's following you to be following us. So now's the time. Send out your text, put your post up, let the, don't pull any fire alarms, but, make loud noises if you feel that's necessary. Do whatever you think you need to do to alert people to the fact that we are here live on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News. And with that, we will dive right into it. And we want to turn to the ongoing saga here of the sort of shaping of the media space in the United States as it concerns how people view China and what they think about it. And to continue with this ongoing story, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Amanda Yee, who is the host of Radio Free Amanda, great podcast, and also an editor at liberationnews.org. Amanda, as always, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey, Rania. Hey, Eugene. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's always our pleasure to have you on, Amanda. And I mean, this is, I every week, every day, I should say, one of the first things that I do, and this is not an advertisement for the New York Times, but just to keep up with the paper that's really setting the agenda in so many ways for what the mainstream media is covering. One of the first things I do is look at the headlines of the New York Times. And over the last several weeks, I've noticed a trend that increasingly the top stories, sometimes even more than one on a given day, are just these like anti-China propaganda stories. It's like a tsunami of them over the last month. And I just want to read a few of the headlines and get your reaction to that. Just from a few days ago, you had, well, first of all, you've got, okay, I'm just going to read a bunch of headlines when you look up China on the New York Times. Why is China in so much trouble when ideology gets in the way of the obvious solutions? How Xi Jinping returned China to one-man rule. China's exports fall for fourth straight month. China's military is going global. China's economic pain is a test of Xi Jinping's fixation with control. China to its people. Spies are everywhere. Help us catch them. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, you really get the sense, especially with this latest one, China to its people, spies are everywhere, help us catch them. You really get the sense that the New York Times really wants us to hate China. But like, what's going on here? Why are we more recently getting flooded with this like insane tsunami of anti-China content at the New York Times? Has China just become like more evil? What's happening?
Okay, so I want to return to that Spies Are Everywhere headline in a few minutes because that one's particularly egregious. But first, I just want to just to say in general, what this signals is that we're in a new Cold War and we are in a major power conflict with China. Like the US is headed toward major power conflict with China. And if the headlines, the media coverage, it really parallels how the Soviet Union was covered during that period in the previous Cold War, right? New York Times coverage of China, it really reminds me of what Michael Parenti said in his book, Black Shirts and Reds, about US propaganda against the Soviet Union during the previous Cold War. He said that Western media coverage could transform any data about existing communist societies, transform it into hostile evidence against that society. So if the Soviets refused to negotiate, they were belligerent. If churches in the Soviet Union were empty, then religion was being suppressed. If the churches were full, that meant that people were rejecting the atheism of the ruling regime. If workers went on strike, it was an expression of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, then that was because they lacked freedom and they were scared of government repression. So it's really similar to how US corporate media has been covering China for the past few years. If they find one person who's critical of the CPC, then that person becomes representative of the entire 1.4 billion population of Chinese people, even though, a Harvard study found that 90% of Chinese people were satisfied with their government. But then this study becomes evidence that Chinese people are lying because they're afraid to criticize the CPC in public. The successful containment of COVID, its successful dynamic zero COVID strategy somehow gets repackaged as a human rights violation. De-radicalization of religious extremists and the prevention of terrorist activities through economic development of Xinjiang, that's suddenly framed as a genocide. And then when they can't find any evidence of a genocide occurring, then it becomes repackaged as cultural genocide. And then we see a lot of, the anti-corruption campaigns and reining in of capital, efforts we would love to see in the US, is framed as Xi ruling with an iron fist. So, I think what this really signals is that the US is preparing itself and the public for a major power conflict with China. So there's that angle of it. But also, the New York Times just has a really long history of red baiting and McCarthyism in general. This is part of a much longer history of them engaging in this kind of red baiting. They have always been very reliable purveyors of Red Scare hysteria against anyone who challenged US foreign policy. In 2016, they published a story about Green Party candidate Jill Stein, in which they baselessly smeared her as a Russian asset, whose entire presidential campaign was promoted by Russian operatives. The New York Times has been a reliable actor in the previous Red Scare of the 1950s. During this period, they'd published articles fear-mongering over communists among public school teachers and union organizers. But it was really the leaders of the Black liberation struggle that were the most viciously attacked, right? For instance, the New York Times in 1949 described Paul Robeson as a Black Stalin with delusions of grandeur. And also during the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were accused of sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union, the New York Times demonized the pair all the way up to their execution. And when the execution came, the newspaper ran an entire column on the front page running a play-by-play of their execution. So this is just part and parcel of what the New York Times does in the service of U.S. imperialism.
No, excuse me. I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And I think, honing in especially on the point you were making about the preparations for, a real confrontation with China, or not the preparations, the first stages of a real confrontation with China that we're seeing, I think is especially important vis-a-vis the one article that Rania mentioned that I thought was new, it was just mind-blowing to me about, whatever the headline was, China telling its people that spies are everywhere. And the thing I just couldn't get out of my head was that map that I think several people have done in several different ways of the huge number of American military bases surrounding China. And obviously, of course, the fact that China has no military bases surrounding the United States or really anywhere except one place in the world. And it just felt almost like it was like a mirror image of what America is doing, but then sort of projected onto China. So anyway, before I editorialize, talk about that if you could, because I thought it caught a number of people's eye.
Yeah, so that headline, China to its people, spies are everywhere, help us catch them. As we like to say, when the US government or corporate media talks about China, every accusation is a confession, right? This article was particularly egregious and really audacious on the part of the New York Times, considering that just a few weeks ago, they published a baseless story smearing organizations like No Cold War and Code Pink, organizations that have been very vocal against this escalating aggression against China. They smeared them as foreign agents in service of the Chinese government. And just days after this New York Times article was published, the Wall Street Journal ran ran another story. And the first sentence of this article, it said, Chinese nationals, sometimes posing as tourists, have accessed military bases and other sensitive sites in the US as many as 100 times in recent years. According to US officials who described the incidents as a potential espionage threat. So just within the past year, we've seen this mass hysteria by these same corporate media outlets around a so-called Chinese spy balloon, which according to US officials, months after it was shot down, it didn't actually collect any intelligence. We've seen stories about a so-called Chinese military base in Cuba, which actually doesn't exist. We've seen stories of secret Chinese police stations operating in New York City, Chinatown, and across the world, which are neither secret nor police stations. Now they're fear-mongering over Chinese nationals posing as tourists. And in 2020, we saw Trump issue an executive order which canceled the visas of thousands of Chinese nationals, of Chinese grad students studying in the US. And Biden has continued that policy through the regular denial of visas to Chinese researchers. And then under the China initiative, we saw the Department of Justice ruthlessly target Chinese academics and researchers in the US as foreign agents for, as little as, failing to account for a foreign affiliation on a grant form. So they were targeted as foreign agents because they filled out a grant form wrong. And then more recently, we've seen the state go after activists who've been speaking out against this new Cold War. So given all this, I think we really have to ask ourselves, who is the one that's really paranoid about foreign enemies? At the same time, I think it's also really important to point out that insofar as there really exists a fear or nervousness or what the New York Times calls, paranoia on the part of China over US spies, how can you say that it's not justified? The US is the one that has a long history of overthrowing governments it doesn't like. It's the one that deploys CIA operations across the globe to repress left-wing or nationalist governments that try to assert any kind of national sovereignty. It's the one that makes up excuses to invade countries only to turn them into resource colonies. It's not China doing that, it's the US. And so, of course, it does it through military means, but also through much more insidious ways, like through the funding of USAID projects, National Endowment for Democracy programs, and the creation of local NGOs. And these are all tools that the US empire uses to try and reshape civil society in a way that makes it more conducive or accepting of US intervention under the guise of democracy. So this has happened, and this is still happening in countless areas of the world that resist US hegemony, even in the slightest way. And right now, the US is rapidly moving toward a full military confrontation with China. It's corralling all of its resources in preparation for a military, like a war. It's the empire's number one enemy. So if China is nervous about spies, it's not without reason or historical precedent.
Those are all excellent points. It's pure projection. And it's also, I'm curious, Amanda, if you could talk a bit about the media's role here. I mean, I know that's essentially what we're having a conversation about because this started out as a conversation about the New York Times. But when you look at the way the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post covers this, I mean, you hear so much from the US about state media in Russia, state media in China. But yes, these are corporate media outlets, but they might as well just be regime outlets, the way that they cover this stuff. But can you talk a bit about the importance of the media's framing here and really, I guess the word would be priming the American public for some sort of looming war?
Yeah. The US, as we've pointed out a few times, it is preparing for major power conflict with China. It's using every tool at its disposal. Just as it did to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the US is applying the same policy of containment against China, which involves military pressure and encirclement, subjecting it to bans and boycotts, cutting it off from key technologies to thwart its economic development, while also fueling these particular contradictions within China, which the US hopes will lead to balkanization. And this is where the role of the media comes in. This is why over the past few years, we've seen corporate media constantly push these news stories about the Hong Kong protests, about supposed genocide in Xinjiang, about Taiwan independence. It's not because the US government or the media cares about them. It's because they're trying to use these issues as pressure points in the hopes of splitting up China into a bunch of different ethno-states that are easier for US imperialism to penetrate and manage. So the idea behind this containment strategy, then as now, is that they hope that this is constant external pressure applied by the US would then heighten these internal contradictions that are going on, magnify these internal problems such that they'll boil over and China will collapse from within. And, that is the role of the media. It manufactures consent for this upcoming war. And war with China pretty much enjoys bipartisan support among those in Washington, right? I mean, we're witnessing right now a whole political realignment happening within the Republican Party among the Trump wing of the party, people like Josh Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene, where their entire political program pretty much is trying to end U.S. involvement in Ukraine in order to direct those resources toward a war with China. And the reason for this is because China is rising. It's managed to contain COVID with its zero COVID policy, its life expectancy has now surpassed that of the US. It's implemented a poverty alleviation program that was really successful and eliminated extreme poverty. It's developing its Belt and Road Initiative, which will eventually shift the economic center of gravity toward China through better connecting it to like the emerging economies of Africa and other parts of Asia, right? And really, China, along with BRICS, which it's a part of, represents something significant, especially to those in the global south. And it represents the beginnings of a shift away from this US-led unipolarity, away from this world order that it created after World War II, where the US kind of united all the former imperialist powers under Washington's leadership and made it so that every institution was created to ensure US dominance and advancement of US interests. So, we had the UN on the diplomatic front, NATO on the military front, on the economic front, we have the IMF and the World Bank and the establishment of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And so China represents a shift away from that US-led unipolarity. And that's why the US is so threatened by it, because China signals the possibility of something different. And that's why we're accelerating toward this major power conflict. And that's why the US media is, increasingly ramping up its anti-China demonization.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Amanda, we are very, very honored that you were willing to come on and help us sort through all of this. You are, of course, an editor with liberationnews.org, where people can check out your writing on this topic and many other great things, and also the host of Radio Free Amanda, which hopefully is also a podcast that everyone is following. But thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, always love Amanda's analysis. And after you're done watching this, I encourage people to go check out the episode I did with her last month on a lot of what we just talked about and more.
Yes, Rania Khalek's Dispatches, great show. And of course, some of it is behind a paywall, so to speak. So you have to be a patron to get not the good stuff. It's all great, but the real cream of the crop there. So patreon.com/breakthrough news if you want to get in on all of that. And of course, make sure you hit subscribe and the bell here on YouTube so that you don't have to go too far to find it. And also just want to quickly shout out August Metz for your donation here on YouTube. Don't forget, just below the screen, you can make a one-time donation right here, but patreon.com/breakthrough news for ongoing patronage. We are going to turn our attention. Yes, Rania.
Well, Eugene, just real quick, I love that there's almost 1,000 people watching. Hello to everyone. Make sure you also smash that like button. Smash that like button. It helps us in the algorithm. Go ahead, Eugene.
Agree. I agree. We're going to turn our attention now to Mexico, where the 2024 presidential election is now set. Both candidates are in place. And for this conversation, we are again honored to be joined by a good friend of the show, Alina Duarte, who is an independent journalist and also a senior research fellow. Wow, I'm struggling, at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Alina, thank you so much for being back with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me once again.
Well, really, really happy to have you here. There's a lot happening. Of course, yesterday was a big day in Mexico. Morena, the ruling party, was able to set their candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, current mayor of Mexico City. So maybe let's just start there. I know we also have Xochitl Galvez on the right wing, who has also been named the candidate of the so-called Broad Front. But perhaps let's start with Morena, the current ruling party. I learned from you, Alina, that last night many thousands of people came out onto the streets, with excitement about what is happening here with Claudia Sheinbaum as the candidate. So who is she? And maybe give us a sense of what it means for her to be leading Morena into the elections.
Well, Eugene, yes, as you said, during the last hours, we have had great news. After 2 months of an internal content, Morena and the Alliance, together making history, Juntos Haciendo Historia, have chosen Claudia Sheinbaum as their presidential candidate. This announcement was in the World Trade Center here in Mexico City, and there were thousands of people just arriving every hour outside just to know who was going to be the presidential candidate. The the current. The process was in the between the former chancellor Marcelo Ebrard and Claudia Sheinbaum. Marcelo didn't want to accept the results, even when, as Rania says, because she was here and she interviewed Claudia Sheinbaum months ago. Months ago, who was the front runner, Claudia Sheinbaum, and it was like a no big surprise because of this. The polls were showing all the time that she was the front runner. And also, it's so important to say that President López Obrador this morning announced that his term as the leader of the movement of the so-called for transformation ends today. So in a few hours, he will hand over the so-called baton of command to Claudia Sheinbaum. It's going to be something really important during the next hours. Claudia Sheinbaum, she was a scientist. She's an academic. She was an academic of the most important university of Mexico here not only in Mexico City, but in the whole country. She was a scientist. After that, she was a mayor of like a part of here in Mexico City, and also she's the former governor of this city. After that, she decided just to leave a month ago to run for the presidency, and she made it last night. It was a difference about 10 points of difference with Marcelo Ebrard, so there was no doubt. There were so many polls all around the country in the last week. During the last week, there were so many polls that said exactly the same, that she won. So the president was so happy this morning during the so-called mañanera, this morning daily conference. And also the people outside the World Trade Center last night, it was just amazing. The rest of the candidates, the 4 candidates of the alliance, also decided to say that Claudia Sheinbaum was the candidate, so there is no another kind of doubt. The president also said that Marcelo Ebrard could do what he wants during the next hours. So let's see how it goes during the last months. The elections are going to be held in June 2024. It's still a year from the elections, so it's a lot of time. And in the other side, as you said, Eugene, there is another candidate called Xochitl Galvez, who is representing this the broad front here in Mexico. It's an alliance. Practically, their mask is that they are the right-wing parties in Mexico, but also the big oligarchs in this country have been supporting her all the time. And this is something that the president has been saying during the last months. The electoral tribunals actually acted against the president for saying this during his conference. And Xochitl Galvez, she has been saying that she's an indigenous candidate, that she's a woman, a feminist one. So also that she's a Trotskyist, and almost, I don't remember if she said that she was a Marxist Leninist, but this is this is something really funny. But this is something because of the fourth transformation, that everyone now see, or at least 70% of the population here in Mexico, between 60 and 70%, now sees as a good thing to be leftist. So that's why I explained that Xochitl Galvez had to say something like that. The intern process of the right-wing alliance, definitely it was a fraud. It was something that we already knew months ago. They decided to do a kind of polls and debates and something like that. But months ago, we already knew that she was going to be the candidate because of these alliances between the oligarchs. So let's see if for the next months what's going to happen. I think that Xochitl Galvez, I don't think she's going to resist for the next months. There are so many acts of corruption during her administration. There are so many debates around her that she's not really indigenous. So let's see.
Yikes. Well, we'll definitely be looking out to see that. I mean, one of the ways it's being framed so far, at least in the US media, is that regardless of who wins, Mexico is going to have its first female president, which is important. But of course, that's like the very superficial way to look at it. I'm curious, Alina, if you could just briefly describe what's at stake here? I mean, obviously, yes, you have a left-wing candidate and a right-wing candidate, but AMLO has been in charge for so long, and Claudia Sheinbaum obviously represents his party, and a lot has been accomplished during his time as president. So what is at stake and I guess protecting here in terms of like what the left has gained and of course moving forward, because of course the right-wing agenda would be to undo everything.
Well, there are two national projects. Definitely, one of it is one of the oligarchs, the oligarchies here in Mexico. There's no doubt about it. The other, built by the people. It's important to say that even the Mexican corporate media didn't say that there have been several assemblies during the last 2 months around the country to find out what the people want. You know, we've been building. Also, I'm part of the National Political Formation Institute of Morena, and we've been building these assemblies around the country to ask to keep asking to the people what they want, what the fourth transformation has done and what hasn't. And for the last 2 months we have had conferences, these assemblies, and the people practically wrote the next project of nation that we are gonna present during the next days. It's the project that Claudia Sheinbaum is gonna sign. It's totally different as the project of the right wing here in Mexico that is being written by the people who practically dismantled the Mexican state during the last decades. So in stake there is a lot. It's not only about the continuity of the so-called for transformation. It's just to like it's also about building with the people. It's not easy what's going on here in Mexico after the government of Felipe Calderon in 2006. There was a so-called war on drugs that actually there are more than 200,000 people disappeared, more than 250,000 people who has been killed during this war on drugs, that it's completely a civil war here in this country. The violence, the feminicides. Also, after the pandemic, we saw what was going on in the public healthcare system here in Mexico. So there is a lot that we still need here in the country. So that's why it's so important to know that there are two national projects, totally different. One that represents the interest of the oligarchies here in the nation, and the other one built by the people, with the people. And also, it's not only Claudia Sheinbaum. It was so amazing for me to see yesterday that even people who were supporting Claudia Sheinbaum outside the World Trade Center, they were saying things like, we are gonna be with her, we are gonna build together the fourth transformation. So it was really, really inspiring what happened last night.
No, I mean, it does seem like that maybe is one of the greater takeaways about the overall process. And I think you've spoken to, and that maybe the concept of the fourth transformation, just to maybe close on that point, Alina, the idea that this is not just an issue of candidates here, AMLO, Claudia Sheinbaum, or whoever. This is really a renewal of the process of the Mexican people to move their country forward another step.
Yeah, well, this is the so-called transformation, as you said, because AMLO has been insisting that it's a new era for this country since 2018. The first big movement here in Mexico was the independence. After that, the revolution. The other one was the reform war, and now it's the fourth transformation of the public life, as AMLO says all the time. So the next year, and it's amazing because, as you know, in Latin America, well, I haven't seen this, that we are talking about the next president after big leaderships as Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez. It's important to say that, for example, here in Mexico, now AMLO has been saying this generational relief that we, with a complete year before the elections, we're going to be all together with Claudia Sheinbaum, with the rest of the candidates, with the president. And after that, he has insisting all the time that he's going to leave presidency, and he's going back home and he's not going to say anything after 2024. That's something that people still don't believe after a leadership of almost 30 years in this country. The last time we had a leader like this, it was like 70 years ago with Lázaro Cárdenas, and now we cannot even believe that it's still only a year with with this president, with AMLO. So I think a lot of things had changed. There was a presidential inform like 2 weeks ago, something like that, and we all knew that, as he said, that it wasn't only like a jingle. That first, the poor people, for many years he has said something like that in the rallies, in the conferences, everything, that he was gonna build with every Mexican, but first in his agenda was gonna be the poor people, the excluded people. And in his last inform 2 weeks ago, we knew that the poverty, inequality has been decreasing during the last 5 years. So now it's a reality. Everything can see here in Mexico. I mean, there are so many things that we still have on the agenda, so many challenges. As I say, the violence, for example, I think is the main cause of people is still asking for security, for I mean, so many things. So I think it was such an amazing announcement what happened last night, and that's why people, I think, there's no doubt that Claudia Sheinbaum is gonna win the election, even when it's still a year for far from this election. So let's see. Eugene, Rani, I'm so happy about what I saw yesterday with the candidates, the alliance, the people outside the World Trade Center, and even on social networks, everyone was so happy. Not everyone. I'm still. I need to say that the Chancellor Marcelo Ebrard is going to have an announcement during the day to see if he is going to be an independent candidate, or if he is going to leave Morena, or if he's going to I don't know, to participate in the election, in the presidential election, with another political party. So there is still the doubt what's going to happen with Marcelo Ebrard and his team.
Well, as always, Alina, really appreciate you helping us sort through all of this. Hopefully everyone is following your work very closely. You're reporting all of the issues in Mexico quite well. Senior Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, independent journalist Alina Duarte, thank you as always for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
As always, thanks for inviting me, and I'll be here every time you call me.
Fantastic. Yeah. Really,
it's going to be important to keep watch on that.
No, it is.
I really can't believe this guy is going to try to be a spoiler potentially.
He needs to sit down. I don't even want to get into that on air, but he needs to sit down. That's like unbelievable. But we shall see. You, of course, had the interview that Alina mentioned alongside Zoe from People's Dispatch with Claudia Sheinbaum. You can go to you're on our YouTube page, so you can certainly find it there. Also, if you go to our social media, our Twitter page, or excuse me, X, we recently put that back up this morning if you're looking for it. But long, in-depth interview with Claudia Sheinbaum talking about where she is, where she's going, and what she hopes for Mexico, which very, very, very worth your time. I can say that for sure. But we are going to keep the movement moving on here, and we're going to turn to Big Pharma. And believe it or not, they're continuing their machinations to keep the prices of drugs very high. And we are quite honored to be joined for this conversation by Andrew Perez, who's a senior editor and reporter at The Lever. Andrew, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're really happy to have you. And I also just want to note at the outset that along with Matthew Cunningham Cook, you are the author of Big Pharma's American Con, about the issues we're going to jump into here at levernews.com, which I hope everyone reads. But, you know, Andrew, it was a great piece, by the way, and there's so many different elements to it. I mean, it's about like why drug prices are high, how they're trying to keep them high, how it works. But just in the interest of, you know, maybe people who aren't following everything in the news, maybe give us just a sense of what this Medicare negotiating drug prices, like what that is and how exactly it works, just to give us some framing for the conversation moving forward.
Sure. Well, so Democrats have been talking for, the last 2 decades, roughly, about allowing Medicare to begin negotiating drug prices. When Congress passed the Medicare Part D program, when they created it, in 2003, they actually banned Medicare from negotiating drug prices, and instead basically allow private insurers to negotiate those drug prices instead. And, it's one major reason why drug prices and healthcare costs generally are exorbitantly high in the United States compared to other countries. And so, last year, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats have enacted the first basically pilot program allowing Medicare to begin negotiating drug prices, which, to be clear, is something that like most other countries do. Potentially nearly all other countries do this. Most all industrialized nations other than the U.S. allow this already. And it's, they're able to force a lot lower prices overseas than we do here.
It's really amazing just to give like people an idea of how much of a difference we're talking about. You mentioned in the piece that it's like these drug prices, and you give a few examples of specific medications, but in the US cost up like something like 1,000% more than in other countries. And I'm actually speaking to you right now from Beirut, Lebanon, where, I mean, despite the fact that Lebanon has been experiencing a horrible economic collapse for the last several years, I can still go to any pharmacy and purchase the same medications that exist in the US from the same drug makers. I'm always shocked how cheap it is here. Like constantly, like whether it's antibiotics, or whether it's like a muscle relaxant, or I don't know, like an eye drop, whatever I've needed to go purchase from the pharmacy, I'm always like, it's $3, it's $4, like really cheap. And the same thing in the US would be like $20, $25, $100, depending on what medication you're talking about. But like, explain why that is the case. Why even like a third world, very poor, economically collapsing country like Lebanon has drug prices for literally the same brand name items that in the US we're paying 1,000 times % more for.
Yeah, I mean the main primary reason is that the government has actually restricted itself from negotiating drug prices. That is the main reason. There's also there's all these kind of patent schemes that pharmaceutical companies have going where they can we grant them like long-term exclusivity, and then they're able to turn that into an even longer term exclusivity by just barely tinkering around with their product. It's something that has been going on for a long time, and it is a giant issue. And compounding this is actually the U.S. Government subsidizes the research and development that goes into virtually every drug approved for sale in the U.S. So what's happening here is that we, the American taxpayer, the public, we subsidize the creation of these pharmaceutical products, and then we actually allow pharmaceutical companies and have designed the system so that they're able to charge us much higher prices here than anywhere else. And it is literally because we do not allow the government to negotiate drug prices. And the program that's starting now is really small, right? It's actually about 10 drugs per in 2026 can be negotiated. 10 very expensive drugs that are specifically have been around for anywhere between 9 to 13 years. So they're nearing the end of their exclusivity period. The government made a very small negotiation program because the legislation was really scaled down by some Democratic lawmakers who are friendly with the pharmaceutical industry.
You mentioned this, just now, sort of in terms of the subsidies, Andrew, but I was hoping you could actually talk more about that, because I think one of the interesting things in the piece that you all lay out is the how much money the U.S., the government, is spending on helping to develop different, pharmaceuticals, and also, the impact that, or the relationship that has to this issue of high prices. Because of course, this is what we always hear in this debate is, well, you have to have high drug prices because that's how they do the research, and without that, we'll have no drugs and we'll all die.
Yeah. Well, so the U.S. government, we spend $45 billion annually on the National Institutes of Health, which then funds new drug research. And basically, like, studies show that every single drug that's approved for sale in the U.S. is benefiting from this research in one way, in one form or another. And sometimes it's quite substantial, where the U.S. government is developing the technology that's being used to deliver these drugs. That's something we saw even with the COVID vaccines. Is the technology, the mRNA technology at the core of the Moderna and the Pfizer products, it was developed by the U.S. government.
Yeah, well, and then I'm curious, like, if you could also talk about, like, when it comes to these, like, lawsuits you mentioned in the piece, where these pharmaceutical companies are, like, suing the U.S. government, who's, like, ruling in their favor? And you mentioned some Democrats being in the way as obstacles. I imagine Republicans as well. But, like, who do they have on their side in this massive bureaucratic structure that's constantly working in their favor, that keeps it so that these prices remain crazy high?
Yeah. Well, so judges definitely play a role here, where some have, we wrote about here how one of the drugs that is up for negotiation actually had a generic or a biosimilar approved like a decade ago, or close to a decade ago, and they were able to then prevent it from coming to market until 2029. But yeah, you're right. Republicans play a major role here. They've played a major role in keeping this system in place, where we cannot be negotiating drug prices. They're still complaining about it today with this very small ball negotiation program. And then, we also saw several corporate Democrats, Kirsten Sinema, now an independent, played a major role in sort of scaling this back. Scott Peters played a major role in that. Kurt Schrader played a big role in scaling this back. There was a small subset of House Democrats who worked together and basically hand in hand with Kirsten Sinema to scale down the program. On the other hand, like the case for this program, that advocates would make is like, okay, yes, it's small. It's also the first time that anyone in Congress can remember the pharmaceutical lobby losing a battle, right? Like they have a very, very strong track record, including even in the Part D program in its creation, having actually blocked Medicare from negotiating drug prices. So that would be the advocates, celebrating some win here, is that like, hey, we actually accomplished something. This is the first negotiation program. On the other hand, the program probably is so small that it's not going to really drastically reduce drug prices. And, they also are still allowing pharmaceutical companies, when they create new drugs, when they start bringing them to market, to basically set their own launch price. That does not happen in other countries.
Wow, that's amazing. But I guess when you pay the money, that's what it is. And I mean, one of the other pieces that you put in here too, I mean, and I think that's always worth noting here. I mean, what do we know about how these corporations are making off in the current system? I mean, I think, in terms of profits, the people know they're making a lot of money. I assume they're doing a lot of share buybacks and the like. But, how's the living for big pharmaceutical companies in our current system?
Yeah, very good. They're one of the most profitable industries in the country, without question. And the U.S. has been allowed to be their profit center. The thing is, these companies are making money elsewhere, right? Like, they wouldn't be selling their products out of some like generosity or benevolence at lower prices overseas. They just have been allowed to gouge the American public in a way that other countries simply have not tolerated.
Yeah, well, I
what's
definitely
amazing
think
too?
that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rania.
No,
Please.
I was just gonna say it's amazing too, because another point you make in the piece is the fact that so much public funding goes into the whole, R&D, the research and development of all of these medications that they're making the profit off of, and then they're of course claiming like, oh no, like if we lower the prices, then we can't fund the research, when like the vast majority of research is actually coming from tax dollars.
Yeah. Well, so to that point, and to what Eugene was saying earlier, they actually, there was a study last year that found that pharmaceutical companies over the last decade, did spend more on stock buybacks and dividends to reward shareholders than they spent on R&D. So yeah, we're subsidizing the R&D and effectively subsidizing these, buybacks, dividends, and the like.
Amazing. Well, at least, some progress is some progress. So perhaps the forward motion, the point you made there about them taking one defeat is the point to rest on here. But Andrew Perez from The Lever, senior editor and reporter there, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Levernews.com.
Really
you can check out that article, Big Pharma's American Con. Really, really highly recommended, actually.
Yeah, great website, great article, and really, really outrageous. I mean, when you look at those numbers, and I'm telling you, Eugene, like I'm always stunned whenever I go to a pharmacy to get anything in Lebanon. And I'm just like, how is this, like things that I've got, I know I've spent, and it's like apparently 1,000% more on in the US, where I'm just like blown away by how much cheaper it is here. And I guess now I understand why that's the case.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, I, travel a fair amount internationally, and I'm always surprised. I often get requests from people for like, different esoteric drugs that they're using. Like if you can find it there, and it's never like I'm going to a developed country. So, I mean, it just tells you everything you need to know. I was in Haiti and people were like, hey, by the way, if you go to a pharmacy and you see any of these drugs, bring some back for me. And I was just like, okay, well, tells you everything you need to know about America. Really, just an amazing reality there. But yeah, no, it's very interesting sort of issue here, how we've just been so ridiculously price gouged for so long. I'll never forget the debate that CNN did between Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren on one side, and then Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz on the other side about healthcare. And it was just very funny because they were so Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz. They had nothing really to say to come back whatsoever about why we shouldn't have universal healthcare. So they kept looking for things to say, and they kept saying, well, we're for lowering drug prices. We're for lowering drug prices. We're all for lowering drug prices. And then both of them refused to sign on to any bill to lower drug prices for the next 2 or 3 years. And then, have been very vocally criticizing the bill that brought in this most recent, the Inflation Reduction Act, that brought in the most recent lowering of drug prices. So it's like even the one thing they tried to be for, they are not really for. And I just feel that, well, says everything you need to know about those two people, but also just about American politics in a way that you could be talking about the same issue for like 50 years. The public opinion polls could show over and over again a supermajority of people support it. Most Republicans support it. And somehow still you barely can get over the line with a program that everyone would support.
Well, what I recommend, Eugene, is, I think this sounds like corruption to me. And in order to help the American people, I suggest targeted sanctions against individuals to hold them accountable for robbing their own people, for killing their own people. Anyways, I think we know where I'm going with this.
Yes, those might be sanctions I would support. Nonetheless, we are going to turn the page here now to the center of geopolitical controversy, at least this week, and that is the potential meeting between Kim Jong-un, the president of, or the head of, I should say, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. That could be coming up in Vladivostok, maybe sometime soon. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the conversation by Brian Becker, who, among other things, is the host of the Socialist Program, whose video version airs here on Wednesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Brian, thanks so much for being with us.
Great pleasure. Thanks so much.
Well, great to have you here. And as you could probably tell in my intro, part of the thing I find so interesting is it hasn't even been confirmed that Kim Jong-un and Putin are meeting. I mean, it seems I can see them meeting. It certainly seems like something that would happen. But just the possibility of them meeting has become this huge story in American news, driven by the New York Times, CNN, and the like. And I just wonder, from your perspective, why is a meeting between two neighboring countries' leaders such a big deal for the U.S. media, even before it's 100% confirmed?
Well, the U.S. never wants to miss an opportunity to caricature and demonize both Kim Jong-un. So the two of them possibly meeting together, you get, your double your money's worth. I mean, you can demonize both. And the fact that that they're meeting together, let's face it, guys, Russia and the DPRK share a border. I mean, if the United States actually met with the president of Mexico or the president of Canada or the prime minister, I mean, would it be like such a big deal? But the story here is that should they meet, and that they might be meeting, again, it's all from the Western media. It's from the New York Times and other Western capitalist media. Even RT, the Russian media outlet, the English language media outlet, is covering it from the point of view of what the New York Times is reporting. So there's not independent verification. But, the reality is that Russia, and before it was Russia only, when it was the Soviet Union, also shared a border with the DPRK and had a close relationship with the DPRK, as did the People's Republic of China. When the U.S. invaded Korea in 1950, and the U.S. destroyed everything in the country, more than 4 million Koreans died, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1967. The U.S. pilot's main complaint was that there was nothing left to bomb, and that was by January 1951 because they bombed everything. And they kept bombing for 2 more years, even though there was nothing left to bomb. At that time, the DPRK, North Korea, basically fought the United States and its allies to a standstill and drove the United States back below the 38th parallel, where U.S. troops continue to occupy the Korean Peninsula today. And it did so with the assistance of China. China sent more than 1 million soldiers, volunteers to fight against the United States, and with ample military aid and economic assistance from the Soviet Union. So Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, and China and the DPRK share a border. China also shares a border with DPRK. They have had a long-standing relationship. It was only really in the 1990s when basically China and Russia basically turned their back on the DPRK, sort of let the DPRK face the might and attacks from U.S. imperialism almost by itself, that relations between Russia and China and the DPRK deteriorated, but they never broke. And so what we see now is that DPRK will meet again with Russia, presumably. They did so when Putin and Kim Jong-un met in 2019. Again, the U.S. media is making a great deal out of it, as if DPRK is going to provide the necessary ammunition so that Russia can continue its war. By the way, everybody, the DPRK military budget is not larger than the New York City Police Department budget. It's $4 billion. So
Wow.
The Russian military budget is $60 billion. The United States military budget is $880 billion a year, more than 10 times the size of Russia. So again, the U.S. media is making a huge deal out of this. But we can see, of course, Russia and China have come back to the DPRK. I think it was quite unfortunate that they, in an effort to appease the United States 25 years ago, basically sided with the United States and allowed North Korea to become more isolated. But North Korea proved that it can sort of stand alone if necessary.
Brian, it's interesting and not at all unpredictable. It's very predictable, Jake Sullivan's response to all this, which was to wag his finger and say that if North Korea dares to give Russia weapons, there will be a price to pay, because America is apparently the global police, and only America and its allies can arm Ukraine. Russia's allies are not allowed to arm Russia, or else there's a price to pay. It seems like a very fair game they're playing globally. But what I want to ask you about, Brian, is speaking of the way this is being framed, particularly the fact that Russia has also proposed a 3-way naval exercise with North Korea and China. So this is also, of course, getting a lot of attention in the U.S. media. And it's being framed as like, oh my God, these three evil countries doing naval exercises together or coming together or having any sort of, trilateral agreement of any kind happening in response, by the way, to US, Japan, South Korea having their trilateral alliance, which is very much a military one in an effort to surround China. I mean, the hypocrisy of all that is just incredible. But I guess my point I'm raising here is, in so many ways, isn't this just a reaction? Like, isn't the US literally creating what it fears most and then complaining about it when these countries are just reacting to what it's doing?
Yeah, the U.S. officials seem to have the position that when we strangle you, when we try to destroy you, the only way that you can retain an honorable position is to not fight back, to allow yourself to be destroyed. And that's basically the logic. If countries try to defend themselves or block together in mutual defense, the United States considers that an act of aggression. In other words, you're supposed to just be destroyed the way the Iraqi government was destroyed when the Iraqi government was literally disarming itself on March 19, 2003. They were showing we're good guys. We're going to keep disarming. At the moment that the George W. Bush administration unleashed the shock and awe invasion of Iraq. And a year before that, Rania, on January 29, 2002, George W. Bush, at the State of the Union message, declared that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were an axis of evil. And everyone knew at that time that the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq. And so the logic for North Korea was they're going to invade Iraq, which disarmed itself. Then they're going to come at us and at Iran. And it was at that moment that the DPRK, which had pretty good relations in the last year with the Bill Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, actually visited Pyongyang right before Clinton left office, and there was talk of normalization. But when Bush did that on January 29, 2002, 1 year before the invasion of Iraq, North Korea left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It said we're going to start getting nuclear weapons. It did build nuclear weapons, and it said we won't be Iraq. We are going to demonstrate that we are going to go down fighting if you intend to take us down. You're going to pay a price. And so North Korea became a nuclear power because of the hubris and arrogance, just like the hubris and arrogance that you're, referring to now. The North Koreans were like, no, we're not going to be Iraq. We are North Korea. We fought you in 1950 to 53. We fought you to a stalemate. We're not going to be destroyed by you. And they became a nuclear power. And for a while, China, which was mainly hoping to appease the United States, and Russia, which was still weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and thus was also appeasing the United States, agreed to sanction the DPRK when it started building nuclear weapons. And what we see now, 20 years later, as U.S. animosity and hubris and arrogance and aggression against China and Russia have pushed these countries back into that historic alliance that was so obvious in the early 1950s. So not because they wanted to have hostile relations with the U.S., China and Russia basically have no choice because the U.S. has decided major power conflict is the new priority for the Pentagon, targeting Russia, targeting China. And so the two of them look now to DPRK and say, well, we're not going to continue to isolate you. We're not going to play the game of the U.S., of U.S. imperialism. We can't appease them because they won't accept appeasement. So we'll block together. And as you said, Rania, when they do so, and again, after South Korea, Japan, and the United States, Biden administration met with these other major powers in the Pacific to form an alliance against Russia, against North Korea, and against China. After Biden did that, and Putin says, okay, well, we can reciprocate. We can form an alliance or forge a deeper alliance with the DPRK. And Xi Jinping has also been meeting with Kim Jong-un 4 times in his first, in the period between 2017 and 2020. Then the U.S. says, see, Russia and China are evil, bellicose, aggressive players in the world situation. Again, it's topsy-turvy. It's Alice in Wonderland. But if anyone has any degree of objective faculty, you can see how this is actually played out.
This is a big topic, of course, and there's so many elements of it. But one of the things I think, and everything is, of course, relative is, when you travel around the world, in the global south, especially in Latin America and Africa, there's a lot of respect for North Korea that I think would surprise many people in the United States. But I mean, in the ruling parties of Mexico, Brazil, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Senegal, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Cuba, India, I mean, all of them, important people with large followings, it's not rare to see them say at least something somewhat positive, and in some of those cases, very positive about North Korea, despite all the demonization we've seen here. So as someone who's actually been to North Korea, Brian, more than once, I mean, I'm curious, what do you think it is that people in the global south see that makes them, or at least some of them, reject a lot of what's coming from the Western media that they themselves are also consuming, saying that this is the world's worst country?
I think, Eugene, it's important for Americans especially to understand, because Americans generally don't get it. But the colonized world, and that's the majority of the people of the world, the people who lived under this vicious, undemocratic, the opposite of democracy, colonial rule where foreign powers loot and plunder and pillage and enslave your people, those countries, those populations in the world look to North Korea, not because they necessarily love Kim Jong-un or because they themselves happen to be communists or, camp followers of the Workers' Party of the DPRK. No, it's because North Korea said, we will not be colonized ever again. We will not submit ever again. They are the sort of the embodiment of sovereignty and independence for the colonized part of the world. And so the people in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, they're not thinking, oh, DPRK is terrible because they don't get to vote every 2 or 4 years for some corrupt politician in one of the 2 ruling class parties in the United States. They don't think of it that way. They think like DPRK is a proud country, a strong country, a dignified country, a country that will not be dictated to. Even when Russia and China sort of abandoned the DPRK for those years, when DPRK had to stand alone, the DPRK was like, okay, we'll stand alone. And when you think about the adroitness and the diplomatic skills of the North Koreans, the fact that they were sort of the target in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism, and their basic core big allies abandoned them. And here they are in 2023. They're not destroyed. They're not split apart. They're not broken apart. So the people in Africa, especially, and I think other parts of the global South, they look at North Korea and they say, yes, these are people who stood up to U.S. imperialism, and they won't be pushed around. I was in DPRK 10 years ago when the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that brought the conflict to an end. People around the world know something also the United States population doesn't know. In May 1953, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon unanimously agreed that they would start dropping nuclear bombs on China and North Korea unless North Korea came back to the armistice table, signed a deal so that the U.S. could end a military conflict that the U.S. was losing. The North Koreans did not want to come to that table. They wanted, like Ho Chi Minh, to fight and fight and fight until they expelled the invaders. They knew the invaders would ultimately, and their soldiers would want to go home, and their soldiers were home. So they were going to win. They were going to win the Korean War. They were going to reunify the Korean Peninsula. But I think the Chinese government was fearful. It had just succeeded in its revolution and probably pressured the DPRK to sign an armistice agreement that took place, again, 60 years ago when I was there in 2013. Now it's 70 years. But the people of the third world, as we used to call it, or the global south, they see this determination on the part of the DPRK. That's what's most important to them, is this determination to be a free, independent, and sovereign people, no matter what the odds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Brian, I am curious because there's so much shifting in the world order right now, especially with the expansion of BRICS and, just watching so many countries, as it's an increasingly multipolar world, feel they at least have leverage to, pursue a bit of a more independent path, even slightly more than before. The U.S. is certainly in like a bit of a weakened position compared to 5 years ago or just a few years ago. And that with that sort of all in the background, what is the significance of this particular meeting between the Russians and the North Koreans with all that in mind?
Well, I think the North Koreans, and I want to make sure the audience understands this, the North Koreans basically want a peaceful relationship with the United States. When Trump met with Kim Jong-un both at the Singapore summit in June 2018 and then in Hanoi in 2019, and the Singapore summit that was signed in June 2018, North Korea said, we agree, one, to have peaceful relations, normal relations with the United States. Two, we agree that there should be a stable, lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And number three, if those two conditions are met, we will commit to working towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So North Korea basically still wants good relations with the United States, but it's the United States that won't provide good relations with North Korea. I mean, Trump was ridiculed by the Democrats and Republicans for daring to talk about peace. I mean, I think Trump just wanted a Nobel Peace Prize because Obama had one. But whatever Trump's motivations, the North Koreans were willing to come to the table. Now, if you're going to threaten North Korea, if you're going to simulate their destruction, which the U.S. does with massive war games twice a year, I mean, literally simulating the destruction of the country, North Korea is going to look to Russia, look to China and say, look, we have a mutual problem. We have a common foe. That common foe is the arrogant, hubris-driven U.S. imperialism. Let's stand together. We've always been willing to stand together. You, for a while, abandoned us, but we've never wanted to abandon you. So I think the big picture, as we see BRICS and the development of what people are calling multipolarity, is that the world values the idea of independence and sovereignty and not having to live on its knees and follow the dictates of U.S. imperialism. Not because different countries are communists or socialists or exporting world revolution. They just don't want to be treated like they're like in a semi-enslaved population. A population. No one does. No one wants to live like that. And the countries of the emerging global South, they're saying we're strong enough now. We can be, we can flex some of our own muscles, and we're going to have at least, I would say differentiation in the way the world economy develops. That could be very promising for the DPRK.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Brian, really appreciate you joining the show and helping us sort through all of this. And of course, you are the host of the Socialist Program, which everyone can check out here on Breakthrough News, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time every week. But thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an important issue. And look, I want to switch gears, but I think people in the U.S. have to look at this more objective faculty. And I can say this because I've traveled all over the world. The reality is almost every sub-Saharan African country that's like the U.S.'s best friend, for the average person, the living standard is lower than in the DPRK. I mean, they obviously have many challenges. They have their own system, but the reality is they have free healthcare, free education. They have advanced science and technology. They can shoot satellites into space. There's trains, there's roads. I mean, all these things that are actually you do not have in most of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why in CAR, in Uganda, in DRC, Nigeria, other countries, I won't go on and on, you find many people who are admirers of North Korea, and that's because we're taught this sham history in America, where as long as you have a Western-style democracy, people can be living in abject poverty and everything is okay. You look at Niger, only 37% of people can read. Well, 100% of people can read in North Korea. So you can see how people might be wondering, well, wait a second, maybe this so-called democracy isn't exactly democratic in a small d sense, and maybe it's not delivering what it needs to be delivered. So you, as Malcolm X said many, many times, you should be careful what you read in the newspaper because it'll have you hating the people that you should be loving and loving the people that you should be hating. That's a little bit of a paraphrase, but I think Malcolm X was right then, and it's good advice for now. But let's turn the page a little bit closer to home, Allegheny County, Pittsburgh area, Pennsylvania. We are very happy to be joined on the show here by Carl Redwood, who is a community organizer and a longtime socialist running for Allegheny County Council there in Western Pennsylvania. Carl, thanks so much for being with us here on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, we are really happy to have you. You are a candidate for office. So, just let us know in your run for Allegheny County Council, what are some of the issues that you're hoping to lift up from your community?
The main reason I'm running, I have two main reasons I'm running. One is because the housing situation for Black people in Pittsburgh has really gotten terrible. where there's a forced relocation of thousands and thousands of people from Pittsburgh to these farther out cities. And the main reason people are leaving is because the rents are too damn high. Between 2010 and 2020, we lost 10,000 Black people from Pittsburgh. Between 2010 and 2020, we lost 2,000 people from the city of Wilkinsburg, which is the next city over, which is also part of my district that I'm running for. What I want to do is I want to work towards halting the gentrification process and actually reversing it. However, I don't have illusions that that's going to happen in one term on county council. So it's very important to use the position of county council to help organize our neighbors, our friends, the residents of all our communities to really fight to make housing a human right, and to make sure that housing is more and more affordable for most of our families, which is it's not right now. So the two reasons I'm running, one is to halt and reverse the gentrification process that's pushing Black people out. And the second reason is to use the position to help organize our community into a people's assembly that can start to speak to not just the housing issue, but all the other issues that face us in our neighborhoods. I want to extend the fracking ban. We have a fracking ban just in the county parks right now. I would like to extend it to all of Allegheny County. I also want to make sure that those big corporations like U.S. Steel that pollute the air on a regular basis and pay the fine on a regular basis, I want to make sure that we shut those polluting corporations down instead of just letting them keep paying the fine. I also want to build more support for workers who are trying to unionize in this area. We have Starbucks workers and other workers trying to unionize, but also we have the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest employer of Black women in Pennsylvania. And the single most important thing we could do is unionize those workers at UPMC, and it would help large number of families in our community. We also really need to work to make sure that all workers have the right to organize and support that right. And the same is true for the tenants. Tenants need to have the right to organize. I also support passing a tenant bill of rights for Allegheny County.
Well, those all sound like fantastic issues to be working on, especially from the perspective you're coming from. And I'm curious, this be, I don't know what the representation is like in Allegheny County. Would you see yourself as like one of the few people who would be on city council that would be like working for the working class? What kind of people sit on the city council right now, and what are they working towards?
Yeah, I think on council now, some people will say that there's been a progressive wind in Allegheny County, where what's happened is a number of, within the Democratic Party, there are some people who could be considered the left of the Democratic Party, and some people that could be the right of the Democratic Party. There are a number of people who are from the left of the Democratic Party who have recently been elected. I'm running to the left of the Democratic Party, outside the Democratic Party as a socialist and independent. And there are things that I can work together with some of those left Democrats on to try to get passed. However, it's important to note that the main the root cause of the problems that we face is capitalism. So we can do certain things here to try to make life better for our families. But what we really have to do is we have to link these local struggles that we have to the larger struggle to really try to build a system that will work for the majority of people and put people's needs before the profits of these corporations. We also need to put people's needs between this whole war and carceral and police and prison system that's set up. So there's some big issues that we always have to keep in the forefront as we fight around small reforms. Like, for instance, Allegheny County passed a legislation to raise the minimum wage for the workers who work for the county. That's a good thing, but there's a much bigger issue, and the raise wasn't really enough. So there's a lot of compromises that get made in capitalist politics, and there's a lot of contradictions that we'll face. Even in the campaign, I'm a socialist running in a capitalist election campaign, and that raises many different contradictions itself.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of UPMC and the union campaign that's going on there. And I feel in cities like Pittsburgh, you know, I lived in Baltimore, this is also true. It's true in Cleveland that, you know, there's a connection between, you know, these big university systems, their related, you know, sort of hospital research institutions and gentrification and the policies that are coming about in many of these places. I mean, is there sort of a similar mix of, I guess I'm asking in a way, like, you know, how does that fit into who the ruling class is in a city like Pittsburgh today, which is so well known for the history of steel, mining, and other things? But how is that sort of, you know, arrayed in this post-industrial, quote unquote, era?
Yeah, I think what's happening, there's been a transfer from, you know, I worked in the steel mill at one time. The steel mill's gone now. People worked in a lot of industry. Those are gone. Here in Pittsburgh, we mainly would say that the eds, the higher education, and meds have taken over as the main drivers of industry here. And I would say the people at the top, most of the people at the top of the eds and meds are really managers for the real capitalists. The real capitalists are probably still some of them same old money people somewhere. We don't really see them, but they're still kind of behind the scenes and helping to call the shots. But there's a lot of people that work for them up and down the line. And some of the owners of UPMC, or even though they're nonprofits, they say, they really still work for the same capitalist system overall. And healthcare is a for-profit industry in a nonprofit close.
Indeed. And then another issue, I mean, that you have spoken about here quite a bit already, and then also appears often on your website, is the issue of policing and prisons. And you actually tie the issue of jail to when you talk about power to all workers, and the fact that there are people in Allegheny County Jail who are working for free. So can you talk a little bit about the issues and how you're fighting for them when it comes to the carceral system and the issue of policing?
Yeah, really, the main thing I believe around that is we need to divest from military and policing and invest in our families and our communities. And was really important to make the link between the local police, the local prisons, and the international military, U.S. military complex that's set up all over the world. The police are just the local military in our neighborhoods. And what we need to do is we really need to cut budgets for all that kind of carceral stuff and shift those funds to help meet the needs of our people. The biggest cut that we need to make is on the military overall, which takes such a huge portion of the budget, the federal budget, and shift that into helping meet people's housing needs, healthcare needs, and other needs. That's the big picture. On a local level, we can make some shifts as well. Like here in the Pittsburgh area in particular, they say there's more police per capita than are necessary compared to other cities of similar size. All those kinds of things we need to pursue. But bottom line, the police in general don't work for us. They work to help protect the property of the capitalists. That's their main job. And every once in a while, they may do some good stuff. But we need to bring the military back to the United States borders. And when there are floods or hurricanes and other kinds of things, that's when those forces need to be put to work to help improve the lives of people, to be able to fix up after there's natural disasters in a much quicker way. There's other ways that we could repurpose as we need a just transition from the military, just like we talk about a just transition from climate change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Carl, I suspect that there are people who are watching who are probably wondering where they can learn more about your campaign, and I'm sure some in Allegheny County wondering how they can get involved. So where can anyone who is seeing this find where you all are at?
Yeah, follow us at redwoodforcouncil.com. If you go to redwoodforcouncil.com, you can make a donation if you're able to. You can sign up to volunteer. We have people out almost every day talking to voters. We're really talking to people who vote to talk about our campaign. You can look at what I stand for on redwoodforcouncil.com. And if you like what I stand for, hopefully you would consider volunteering, donating, or giving me a vote if you live in the district.
Well, you can see it there, redwoodforcouncil.com on your screen, and that is the website for Carl Redwood, who is running as an independent socialist for Allegheny County Council in the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania and a longtime community organizer. Carl, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Yeah, good to be with you. Keep up the good work.
Right on. Shout out to Claire, campaign chairwoman.
Oh.
She knows who she is, and she knows why I'm shouting her out. So that's, anyway, great to hear about things that are happening there, Western Pennsylvania, that aren't just the, whatever, the New York Times when they do their obligatory, we're here in Western Pennsylvania, the working class, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah.
Talk to Trump voters and explain why they're voting for Trump, because that's all that's important.
No, of course. And then going back to their, brownstones and Park Slope and having really serious conversations, trademark, over wine and cheese about what they've really learned. What you have to understand is when you really go there and hear from them. Sorry, I almost used a really bad word.
I feel like this is a good opportunity, Eugene,
yes,
to remind our audience that since we're not the people we just mocked, and we are instead breakthrough news.
Indeed.
If you appreciate the fact that
we're not like David Fahrenholt or anyone like that whose wife is a hedge fund executive. Sorry, got sidetracked.
Oh wow, David, if you're watching, put up. So, for those who appreciate a good joke by Eugene, followed up with a cringe by Rania, become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. I'm so sorry, it's not a laughing matter.
It's okay.
Please do become a member of Breakthrough News. You can access exclusive content, as help support the show. Also, you can make a one-time donation in the YouTube live chat. And for those who are watching live right now, if you haven't already, please make sure you smash that like button, because it does help boost us in the algorithm. Because we're not married to hedge fund managers. So YouTube, unless you are married to a hedge fund manager, YouTube does not automatically boost your content.
Yes, that's true. So if you like Breakthrough News and are married to a hedge fund manager, email us at info@breakthroughnews.org so we can try to get boosted in the YouTube algorithm. But also perhaps your spouse should go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and make something happen, give back for the evil that you're doing on a daily basis, at places like Blackstone. But, people can look that up for themselves. Especially really smart people like David Fahrenholt and his wife, who went to Harvard, whose wife's father is the dean of admissions at Harvard. So funny how the New York Times, which is always saying negative things about progressive groups and countries around the world, has a lot of writers that are tied to the most elite institutions in America. Who knew?
Oh, most like there's some sort of conflict of interest. I don't know. I don't want to think too much about it, because that would maybe we come to conclusions about.
I would never like to traffic in innuendo or suggesting someone did something that I couldn't prove they did or anything like that. Would never do that.
What we can prove.
It's just been one of those type of days, Ron.
Is that David's wife works for a hedge fund? That's what we can. That's actually not an innuendo.
That's real information.
Genuine, actual truth.
Well, let's move to an actually important topic, not me just roasting people who don't matter how much they deserve it. And that is what is happening in Atlanta involving the Stop Cop City movement, trying to stop this police training facility to promote police terrorism around the world. Of course, people may or may not have seen very major charges, Rico charges dropped on a number of activists in the Stop Cop City movement. And we are very, very happy to be joined here by Kiana Jones, who is a community organizer in Atlanta. Kiana, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, maybe I'll just start here for those who maybe have not seen the news or just maybe seen a few headlines. What is happening with these RICO charges that have been dropped on organizers against Cop City?
We woke up to news a couple of days ago that there had been RICO charges that were handed up in an indictment against 61 activists against Cop City. And many of those activists had previously been charged with domestic terrorism. These RICO charges are just as flimsy as those charges for domestic terrorism. We saw back in March people who attended a music festival being charged with domestic terrorism for simply wearing dark clothes and walking with a group. And with this RICO indictment, we see that mutual aid, solidarity, and food reimbursement are acts that can be considered in furtherance of the conspiracy. So there is a huge conspiracy for people to provide mutual aid, to give community resources, and to donate to bail funds so that activists can be bailed out of jail when they're arrested. A huge conspiracy that has to be thwarted right now.
I mean, can you explain just really quickly, like for those who don't understand what a RICO charge is? I don't think that's like a common, maybe it is to some people. Eugene's giving me a look, but I don't know if it's a common phrase or a common word that most people understand. Sorry, go ahead.
It is very common here in the state of Georgia. We know that we have a district attorney in Fulton County who has gone on record to say that she is a fan of RICO. She loves to use RICO. And now Attorney General Chris Carr has availed himself of a Fulton County grand jury to indict people under RICO. The Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act in the state of Georgia is very, very easy to pin on someone. In the state of Georgia, you don't even have to know someone personally or have made their acquaintance in order to be charged under RICO. What the RICO statute says is that a group of people have come together in a conspiracy to interrupt the operation of government in furtherance of a criminal act. And I'm sorry, I got the domestic terrorism in there when I said interrupt the operation of government. That is domestic terrorism. You're trying to stop the government from running the way that it's supposed to. But with RICO charges, these racketeer influence corrupt organizations supposedly get together and have a concerted mission. They're all working toward a common goal to further some type of criminal conspiracy. So I guess these people were all working toward the goal of making sure that community members could be provided for and that we stood in solidarity against Cop City. And that in and of itself is seen as a crime by Attorney General Chris Carr.
No, I think that's a very important point. And, for people who aren't familiar, RICO was designed for the mafia. So that means that they're bringing laws for the mafia to, community organizations, which in and of itself should tell you something. But, one of the other things that was very interesting to me about this, Kiana, is that they dated the start of the conspiracy to the day George Floyd was murdered, which of course was well before anything happening with Cop City. But it seemed like that in and of itself was a statement from the Attorney General that it's, that he just views Cop City as part and parcel of a bigger, broader, criminal act that goes all the way back to the protests in 2020 that 27 million people around the country participated in.
Absolutely. And I think Attorney General Chris Carr is telling on himself and other government officials that that was the date that their conspiracy started to quote unquote put down these movements. Any movement that seeks to express dissent against the government, any movement that is in opposition of the status quo, any movement that is going to stand against the militarization of police, the privatization of police for corporate gain, which we know that they are there for. Anybody who dares to say, I don't agree and I'm going to speak out, Attorney General Chris Carr is sending a very clear message that this is not the wave here in Georgia. But what we saw after the date that George Floyd was murdered was that the inception of Cop Cities came about all over this country because their concerted effort toward a common goal to repress the voice of the people was then made known. This government came together under one mission to say, we are not going to stand for people rising up. And the thing that was so alarming was that the solidarity that was shown was something that they had never seen before. They saw Black people, white people, LGBTQIA plus people, poor people, indigenous people, Latinx people, all people standing against police terror. And that literally terrified them. So they conspired on that date and going forward to make sure that they would silence the voices of anyone who would dare to speak out against the corrupt nature of police militarization, the corruption of police repression, the corruption of over surveillance of Black neighborhoods, the corruption that we see happening with this proposal to build Cop City. There have been so many backroom deals. There have been so many illegal moves, all of which have been exposed by organizers, by activists, and people in the community at large. And Attorney General Chris Carr is intent on making sure that nothing more comes to light. And the only way that he knows to do that is by these bogus Rico charges.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's also really important to emphasize here, like what you just said, which is like the extent to which the state of Georgia is going to suppress what is pretty widespread opposition to Cop City. And I think a lot of the people who are watching are probably aware to some degree of what Cop City is or have heard about it. But really quickly, can you just give a brief overview? Because it obviously cannot be emphasized enough how dangerous this project is. I mean, not just for the state of Georgia. This is something that's going to be used for the nation as a whole. So can you talk real quick, what is Cop City and why should we be opposed to it?
Absolutely. Cop City is a $90 million plus militarized police training facility that would be set right in the middle of Southeast Atlanta in South DeKalb County, a majority Black neighborhood that's been the victim of environmental racism for a very long time. It would destroy 381 acres of forest land, also disrupt a very vital watershed that is the headwater of the largest water system in Georgia. It would also, in original plans, provide for a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad and a bomb testing facility right in a residential neighborhood. We know that since the original proposal that the helicopter landing pad was taken out, as was the bomb testing facility. However, they have plans to scale up the already existing firing range there, where they will train with the Israeli Defense Force and other forces from around the country from around the world that come from places who have very poor backgrounds on civil rights and human rights. What we would have is a militarized training facility where the city of Atlanta would not only train others, but they would be trained by outside forces in military operations on urban terrain.
Well, and Kiana, to pick up on something you noted there about the helicopter piece and the bomb disposal thing, that seems like, in some ways a response to the fact that there's been a lot of outcry against this entire facility. But I know those two things were highlighted by a lot of people. But I think it does speak to the course of the resistance. I know many tens of thousands of signatures were just collected for a ballot referendum. I mean, so, talk if you could a little bit about the movement itself and the success it's had and the momentum it's building, which I think cannot be separated from the charges that were dropped this week.
Definitely, Eugene. I do believe that the press of the movement against Cop City was very instrumental in convincing those members of the Community Stakeholder Advisory Committee that a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad is not something that we need to have in a residential neighborhood that's situated between two schools. Neither is a bomb testing facility. It's already bad enough that who live in that area wake up and go to bed to gunfire. I know this for a fact because I used to live right behind the forest. I unfortunately had to move because my 8-year-old son was terrified of every loud noise he heard. And there would be times that we would be homeschooling during the day where he would just hit the floor no matter what he heard, because this was constant in our home. But what people also have to understand is that the constant press of this movement has definitely gained momentum. It's brought people into a movement in a show of solidarity where we have shown up and made it very clear, not only to Mayor Andre Dickens and the Atlanta City Council, but to Attorney General Chris Carr and anyone who is watching all over the world, that we will not stand for our forests to be destroyed. We really want our land back because this is our land. We already recognize what environmental racism does to our community. And having people stand up the way we have and not back down is the catalyst for these RICO charges. The fact that the city of Atlanta and Attorney General Chris Carr are well aware that this project is not what the people want. The people have spoken. Not only did we come out to council meetings in mass, we have collected more than 108,000 signatures on a petition for people to decide. And honestly, I believe that these RICO charges are the last ditch desperation effort of the state to quell this referendum petition. The Attorney General has been back and forth in court with us and the city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta, the mayor, and the Attorney General Chris Carr have sought to invalidate not only this referendum, but all referenda going forward. And I need people to understand what that really means. What they're saying is that the people would have no redress when they don't agree with decisions made by lawmakers. This is a very dangerous precedent, but what we see now, clearer than ever, is that fascism is at its peak in these yet to be United States, and that Attorney General Chris Carr has no problem showing the people his whole hand, because that is exactly what we see. These RICO charges are just one way that Attorney General Chris Carr is trying to stamp out the movement. But as he will see, and as the world will see, we can't be stopped. We won't be stopped. We believe in what we're doing. We are willing to fight for this in every way that we know how. We are using a diversity of tactics that has not been seen before in the state of Georgia. And I know for a fact that that's why Attorney General Chris Carr is afraid and why he wants to try to snuff out this movement, but it will never happen.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think as we've gone along, we only see more and more support coming from various different, elements and organizations. And I think even in response to this RICO, I've seen, everyone from the most radical organizers to Fair Fight Action put out statements against the RICO charges. And I think that speaks to the broadness of what's happening there in the Stop Cop City movement. So for those who are watching, Kiana, who are looking for more information or, if they so choose, looking to get involved, where can they go?
They can go to copcityvote.com. They can go to communitymovementbuilders.org. They can also go to stopcopcitysolidarity.com, and they can follow us on social media, the hashtag StopCopCity. They can follow Community Movement Builders and Cop City Vote.
Right on. Well, Kiana Jones, community organizer, and I have to say, member of the fantastic Stop Cop City Choir, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. You guys were fantastic at the Socialist Rising Conference in Atlanta last week. You can check that out on our YouTube, Breakthrough News, by the way. But Kiana, thanks so much for giving us some your very precious time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Rania, please.
Stop Cop City. Stop. I was going to say Stop Cop City. You gotta
Indeed.
stop Cop City. It's like the best name they could come up with. Stop Cop City. Great name for a movement. It's very in your face, very straightforward. You're not like, what are they doing? They're trying to stop Cop City. It's self-explanatory.
It is. Well, Breakthrough News was the media partner of the International People's Assembly Socialist Horizon Conference in Atlanta last week, which was opened by the Stop Cop City Choir, and where I was actually honored to be on a panel with Kiana Jones. And if you go to our YouTube page, go to the live tab, you can find the entire thing from the opening to all the panels to I think probably like the 20 minutes of takedown when we've got to turn off the live stream. So you can really get a whole sense of how it went, but it was great, and they were a great way to start. Very fantastic musical performance there. And, I also just feel like I have to note here, obviously in the context of RICO, Fani Willis, who's the DA of Atlanta, who did not bring the Cop City charges, but, she sort of made this issue a big issue last year because she is the one who brought the charges against Young Slime Life, YSL, Young Thug, the rap entity there that they're trying to charge as some sort of gang and criminal enterprise. And of course, she has brought the Rico charges against former President Donald J. Trump. I think all three of those exist kind of in their own world, but I think it does speak to the deeply sort of, I hate to use this phrase, but authoritarian nature of power in the state of Georgia, where officials of both parties at multiple levels seem to reach for the most egregious instruments to go after those they perceive to be their enemies. But I'll just end on this. This Attorney General Chris Carr is a noted anti-Trump Republican. So for all these people out here saying, Lincoln Project, Republicans are not all bad, this, that, and the third, well, here's one of the anti-Trump Republicans pushing one of the worst possible things you could ever see. So, talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing there. But that's my rant there, Rania.
No, I love your rants today. I love the roasts. Eugene's like on a roast of like a roast roll. Did I ruin it? Like a roll. He's on a roll, but like it's a roast roll.
I didn't know if maybe you were trying to make like some sort of sandwich reference.
No,
or
but I realized that's how it ended up sounding when I said it, and I couldn't take it back.
I do love a good roast beef sandwich. That's true.
Now I'm hungry.
Thank you. As always, that brings us to the close here of our show this week. Rania, anything you think people should be reminded of before they go?
Yeah, I think that if they haven't already, they got to smash that like button. And also, if you appreciate breakthrough news, you like independent media, you like us, me and Eugene, our personalities.
Hopefully.
You should become, God, I'm doing such a, okay. If you like breakthrough news, go to
patreon.com/breakthrough news.
I just, Eugene, the look on your face, I can't help, I like look at the screen and it's just like this look of like, oh God, she's going to ruin it. And then I do. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, become a breakthrough news member. And also, you get access to exclusive content. If you do, you get access to part of my show that's behind a paywall, Dispatches, and also you get access to Eugene's monthly Africa seminar, which is something you definitely don't want to miss. And moreover, I think Eugene, we've reached like almost 1,200 patrons, if I'm not mistaken. So at some point we should come up with some sort of like new perk, like if we get this many, we'll do this. So we're open to ideas on that, but become a patron at some point soon if we get this many. I did it again, didn't I?
I mean, it's okay. We are open to that. We'll try to come up with more perks. We've already got great perks and great swag that you can easily purchase. You can actually get to our store from YouTube. You probably see a little bit of it under your screen, but yes, I'm with you 100%.
Sorry, guys. It's like, don't forget, I'm 7 hours ahead. So like it's almost midnight and I guess I get a little kooky the closer I get to midnight. So woo. Anyways, become a patron, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And smash that like button.
Let's do it. Let's get out of here before you turn into a pumpkin since it's getting close to midnight.
That's true.
Nonetheless, thanks for everyone who watched. Certainly thanks to all our guests. Shout out to our entire Breakthrough News team that makes this show possible. For myself, for Rania, we will see you next time on The Freedom Side.